Yesterday we learnt about prophecy. The parasha this week talks about prophets. And what we found to be interesting is that even though there is a reference in the Gemara that says that there was a period in time of Nevi'im ha'acharoinim, the last of the prophets, and obviously when you read something like that and you hear last of the prophets, you kind of take it literally, and you're seeing what that obviously means, that there are no further prophets. And then we saw yesterday that when you look in the Rambam, and he talks about all of the things associated with prophecy, nowhere in his halacha, and this is what's important, this is halacha, this is the bottom line, the reality, the application of Judaism in practice, nowhere in his halacha does he say that there is a time limit on when there could or could not be prophecy. All he talks about is that people need to be able to attain certain prerequisites in order to become prophets. So that seems to imply that the only thing that may be a factor over the course of time is that people have declined. And so if people have declined to such a point, then it's unlikely that any of the people in our times will earn the rights to actually be a prophet. Then the Rambam, we said in Igeres Teiman, in his letter to the Yemenite community, speaks about the fact that around about his lifetime you can expect to see prophecy again, which is an incredible thought, because it's firstly a lone voice. You don't necessarily hear other people speaking in those terms. And he backs it up with a story, and he says there was a guy and we knew him, and he qualified as a prophet. Now in this week's parasha that we're going to read on this Shabbos, it says, Shoiftim v'shoitrim titen lecha b'chol she'arecha, that you should put judges and policemen at the gates of all of your cities, which basically means that there's an obligation for every Jewish community to have not only a judiciary, but also to have enforcement. So it's judges and policemen. That's the mitzvah. And if you want to know what those two roles are, so Rashi tells us that the judge obviously judges the cases, but the policeman, he says very clearly, they are there to enforce. Haroidim ba'am. They literally are allowed to use some kind of force to ensure that people obey the law. When you look at the Haftarah, which is from the prophecies of the book of Yeshaya, so there he says that there's a promise, Va'ashiva shoiftayich kevarishayna, that in the future, when Mashiach comes, Hashem says, I will return to you your judges as you used to have them originally. And then after that, it says, V'yoyatzayich kevatchila. It doesn't speak about your policemen. It talks about advisors, that Hashem will restore your advisors in the future. By the way, this is quite interesting because it's a messianic prophecy. So recently in the United States, where there were all those protests against the police, and they were calling for dismantling the police forces, so then the knee-jerk reaction of everybody was, oh, that's terrible, how can you say such a thing? So it's clearly misguided. There's no question that the suggestion you should dismantle the police is misguided. But the sentiment is aligned with the time of Mashiach, because when the time of Mashiach comes, we dismantle the police. So it says that at that point in time, there'll be your atzayich. There'll be those who are your advisors. Now, it's interesting because in our parasha, it talks about it in third person. Shoiftim, judges, v'shoitrim, and policemen. But in the prophecy of Yeshaya, it talks about shoiftayich, your judges, and your atzayich, your advisors. Now, of course, there's a big difference between a relationship that is at arm's length, when you just talk about them in the third person, versus a relationship that is like direct, possessive, your judges and your advisors. So that implies that there's a period in history where we needed to have, so to speak, this objective hierarchy of the judiciary and the police. And there's another period in history where you need to have a personal connection. And the personal connection has to be with those people who will judge your cases and advise you. So when somebody advises you, you can assume that they're obviously interested in your well-being, and they're interested in what's going to help you, and they're going to give you insight that you yourself may not have had. So in a landmark sikha that the Rebbe gave on this Shabbos, the 7th of Elul, in 1991, the Rebbe said something absolutely powerful. He says, so what is the Torah telling us at this point? It's telling us, first of all, that there may have been an hiatus in prophecy through the course of history. As we saw, the Gemara says that there was a period of the so-called last prophets, that there's some debate whether or not there is or is not prophecy today. But what is absolutely clear is that there's a prophecy from Yeshaya that says at the time of Mashiach, and it's important to qualify that the time of Mashiach doesn't necessarily only mean after Mashiach has arrived. The time of Mashiach includes the period of the Messianic era. The Messianic era is an unfolding period. It's not like one day life is normal, and the next day Mashiach comes and makes a big announcement and says, from now on life is going to change. But there's an evolutionary process of this era of Mashiach. And one of the predictions about that evolutionary process is that Hashem makes a promise to us through His prophet that He will restore people who can advise us personally. And it doesn't just mean that they can advise us because of their wisdom, because that we've had throughout the whole of our history. That's not something you have to wait for Mashiach to have. We're constantly either seeking advice, giving advice, sometimes giving unsolicited advice. But the bottom line is that advisors they're old. They've always been around. So the chapa over here is that this term your advisors, actually refers to people who are able to advise from a perspective of prophecy. If you look historically, you'll see, even though people always think of the prophet as somebody who stands on a mound and tells everybody what's going to happen or what they need to do in order to avoid what's going to happen, people don't realize that in biblical times, the prophet was quite personable and quite approachable. So, for example, when King Saul was a young man and he had lost some of his donkeys, so he went to the prophet and he asked the prophet, it's like an oracle, tell me, where can I find the lost animals? We find go back further in history, when Rivka she didn't know it, she had twins developing inside of her, so she didn't know that they were twins. And she was quite disconcerted by the fact that there seemed to be this constant conflict inside her. So what did she do? She went to the prophet at the time to find out what's going on. So prophets are not only about these big mega events, the predictions of apocalyptic kind of things that are going to happen. The prophet is quite your atzecha, your advisor as well. And so the Rebbe explained that in this prophecy is a prophecy that before Mashiach comes, you can expect a restoration of prophecy in the Jewish world, which is a fascinating thought. A restoration of prophecy. Now, how do you know if somebody's a prophet or not? That's the real test. I mean, anybody can get up and tell me, listen, I had a vision and I heard a message, and there probably will be people who believe them. So the Rambam defines that there are two ways in which you can determine a prophet. And in both cases, they first have to have certain credentials. And he talks very clearly what those credentials are. They have to have an incredibly high level of dedication to Torah mitzvahs. They have to be people who have worked on themselves in terms of their piety. They have to be people who are well versed in the knowledge of Torah. And then if they tick all of those boxes, then it's possible that a person could actually be a prophet. So there are two ways in which you can test and determine who's a prophet. The one is that they predict on a consistent basis things that will happen in the future, and they come true. But you only test them with regards to things that are positive, because if a prophet predicts something negative and it doesn't come true, that might well be because we listened to the prophet and we did teshuvah as we were supposed to, and that's how we mitigated the disaster. But if a prophet tells you that something positive is going to happen, and then it happens, and of course it was something that nobody else could have predicted, then that would be the sign that that person is a prophet. And if they can do that on a consistent basis, then the halacha is that after 2-3 times that they've made these crazy predictions and they've been absolutely accurate, and this is somebody who's completely dedicated to Torah at every level, then the halacha becomes that we have to listen to whatever they say going forward. So that's the one way that you can identify a prophet. The other way that you can identify a prophet, the Rambam says, and the reason we quote the Rambam is because he's the only halachic authority who gets into the legalities of prophecy. So the Rambam says, if somebody is already determined to be a prophet, and then that prophet tells you that somebody else is a prophet, well, that's enough credentials. They don't have to even prove themselves, because we have somebody who's already accepted in the community to be a prophet, and if they testify to the fact that somebody else is a prophet, that's good enough. So based on that, And anybody who's familiar with the nature of the Rebbe's sichos, the Rebbe would very often say things about the previous Rebbe, about his father-in-law, and sometimes you could tell that he was actually implying things about himself as well. So he spoke a lot in that particular sikha, and as I say, it was a landmark sikha, and people were quite shaken by it. But he spoke quite openly of the fact that the previous Rebbe had proven himself to be a prophet. He had predicted various things that were happening in the world at that time, and they came to be true, and therefore he has the halachic status of a prophet. And then from that, the Rebbe kind of skipped over and said, so therefore we have a responsibility at this time, and that responsibility is to publicize wherever possible that we have a prophecy that we are living in the time of Mashiach, and that Mashiach is about to reveal himself, and that we have to obviously prepare ourselves accordingly. And if I can give you the wording that it uses is that we have to be willing to accept the directives and the instructions of our prophet in today's time. So it's quite a powerful thing. Yesterday we were talking about the fact that there's this this question: is there or is there not prophecy in today's world? And then here you have the Rebbe talking about not only is there prophecy, but we even know what the prophecy is. And the prophecy is specifically about the fact that we're living in the time of Mashiach, and that what's happening in the world is the unfolding of Mashiach, and that we have to, as the Rebbe says in a different place, we have to open our eyes and recognize that we're living in an absolutely unique time, and that's what's happening. This is what's happening in our world. It is the unfolding of Mashiach. So it's easy to get distracted and to say, there's terrible things happening, and there's a pandemic, and there's economic crisis, and there's rising anti-Semitism, or whatever other distractions we tend to focus on. But actually our responsibility at this point in time is to focus on the fact that we are living in the time of the unfolding of a prophecy, the prophecy of Mashiach. Please God, it has taken long enough to unfold. It should not have to take any longer, and we should be able to celebrate the month of Elul with Mashiach in Yerushalayim.